Okay, guys, let's continue reading. Again, we're reading Gods of the Bible, and we're almost done with chapter 8, the birth of monotheism. And then we covered the beginning. In the beginning was polytheism, the father in law of Moses. When Moses met Yahweh, Moses speaks of Yahweh. Yahweh speaks for himself. Joshua's choice. The name of Yahweh. And now we're on page 153, or actually 152, subtopic 8, making sense of foreign names. So let's get started. Let us start by asking some common sense questions. Since the term Yahweh occurs in various forms in non-Mosaic cultures, could this name possibly be an attempt to reproduce the sound of a proper name in another language? Is it not possible that Moses and the biblical authors were just trying to reproduce the sound of a name they heard by writing down the consonants they had? What would happen if a Westerner were to say his name to a population with a completely different writing or phonetic system, perhaps one containing only consonants? How would a name that sounds far removed from what a particular foreign population is used to be represented graphically? What kind of analysis, conclusions, and hypotheses would a scholar make if he found this attempted representation many centuries later without accurate and documented evidence of when and how it originated? In interpreting the Hebrew language, we have to deal with a particular situation characterized by an understanding of the scriptures based on theological thought. This constitutes an actual inversion of the logical process. Instead of founding theological considerations on what is written, a theological approach tends to shape the word meaning based on a prior positions. This happened for the Bible especially during the vocalization process, as Professor Giovanni Garbini points out. And this is a quote taken from his book. Words underwent drastic transformations, changing their meanings according to the ideological needs of the individual biblical authors, which in the final phase of composition were far removed from those at the beginning of the first millennium BCE. Many physiological, religious, enthetic, and esoteric elaborations and mystical and Kabbalistic practices have developed from the Tetragrammaton. But in reality, the name YHWH could be nothing else than the result of the way some languages of that time rendered the sounds of another language, possibly the language in which the Elohim pronounced his name. The situation certainly does not improve even if we carefully observe the other part of the sentence before the Tetragrammaton. The Catholic Encyclopedia, published in the New Advent CD-ROM, sets forth the innumerable difficulties in providing a clear, specific, and unambiguous interpretation of the name of God. I am I am that which I am. I am what I am. I will be what I will be, and I will be what I was, are just a few of the many solutions proposed over time to convey the meaning of what that Elohim intended to mean by Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which precedes the communication of the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, in Exodus 3:14 and 15. There are many questions to be answered, starting with the possible origins of the Tetragrammaton: Indo-European, Chaldean, Egyptian, Akkadian, Proto-Semitic, followed by the complexity of the problem of pronunciation, continuing with the possible grammatical constructions from which various and different hypotheses arise. It is not our intention to go into the merits of this matter, but we would like again to remember the words of Professor Garbini. It is impossible to know Hebrew as it was spoken in pre-exilic times, at least from the point of view of vocalism. We know Hebrew as it was spoken at the end of the first millennium CE. The reconstruction carried out by the Masoretes was not about knowing the linguistic structure of these texts, but their ideological content. And that was taken from Garbini's book. In the face of so much uncertainty, it is not difficult to imagine that even the reformulation of the meaning of the Tetragrammaton was influenced by the desire to ascribe a theological meaning to a term that may have initially had none. The need or desire to find an exact meaning of YHWH arose long after its original pronunciation. Any hypothetical meaning arrived at or based on preconceived religious considerations that still influence many exegetes today. We always remain skeptical, but perhaps we are not so far from the truth if we assume that the Masoretes and their epigenes tried and still try to elicit a message from a term that perhaps had no other meaning than the one it exclusively represented at a proper name. Let us try to forget for a moment that this subject belongs to a text considered sacred by much of Western culture, and let us ask, as in our custom, some questions as devoid as possible of theological conditioning. Suppose a primitive culture were to reproduce the sound of a Western proper name, such as Francisco, in its writing system. Let us imagine that the writing system of this foreign culture has no vowels, only consonants. What would they write? Assuming they use alphabetical writing, is it plausible that they could write FRNCSC? What if a few centuries after the writing of the name FRNCSC, some sages or priests, starting from the written and mysterious signs at their disposal, wanted to derive some meaning from them? What would these exegetes produce if they were swayed by the temptation to find meaning at any cost in the word FRNCSC? What future scholars dealing with this culture understand that the sounds with which the name Francisco was transcribed belong to a foreign, alien language? Would these scholars be willing to accept that the search for meaning in a specific language of this population would lead to nothing? How many would be willing to accept that a hypothetical Westerner who introduced himself by the name Francisco could not intend to communicate anything other than his proper name? If one were to research the name FRNCSC several centuries after the name was announced and written down, how many would be able to explain its true origin? We are not dealing with an abstract hypothesis here, but there are concrete and practical examples of this sequence of events in the so-called cargo cults, which we have discussed in detail in the introduction to this book. In light of what we said in the introduction about cargo cults, we ask ourselves, as we reflect on the origin of the name Jofrem, as it came to be known within the cargo cult phenomena, can we assume that the term Yahweh has met the same fate? Are we so far from reality if we consider YHWH a lexical representation of the sound with which the Elohim pronounced his name in a language very distant and different from that of the biblical people and authors? When the Tetragrammaton was first uttered at the time of Enosh, Genesis 4:26, Hebrew did not exist. Even when Moses heard it, Hebrew had yet to be formed. What language did the people whose families had lived in Egypt for centuries and whom Moses had led out speak? Amorite? Aramaic? Egyptian? According to Professor Garbini, the Israelite tribes must have spoken a form of Aramaic. We wonder then, what is the point of asking what meaning the term YHWH could have in Hebrew when this language was not even spoken, let alone written? Conclusions. The hypotheses we have formulated are consistent with the figure of the Elohim that appears in our work, a flesh and blood individual who was not concerned with theology or spirituality and who, therefore, did not even have the need or desire to give special meaning to his name. Let us not forget that Yahweh explicitly declared that he did not speak in riddles. Numbers 12:8. Yahweh responds to Moses' request to know his name with words that can be interpreted as follows. Yahweh is the one proposing the covenant and will always keep his promises as long as the Israelites do the same. But Yahweh has the upper hand here. It would be a mistake to see the rules contained in the covenant as the result of a negotiation or free discussion between two parties. A complete imposition of the unchallengeable rules and commandments is incorrectly and perhaps tendentiously called a covenant. If reality, as we suspect, the Tetragrammaton YHWH meant nothing in Hebrew. Most likely, as we have seen in the cargo cults, it was the simple rendering of sounds forming a proper name belonging to another language. Tradition has ceaselessly taught to give theological, ontological, and metaphysical meaning to what was probably nothing more than a name. The interpretation presented here is no less valuable than the many other proposed by Philologus, I can't say that word, philologist, exegetes, and theologians. Given the variety of interpretations that have arisen over time, the future may bring clarity, or at least we hope so. Wow. A lot of words, big words. Some I know the meanings of, and some of them I don't. I'm going to have to go back and look those up. But, wow. This was a very interesting book about Yahweh and how it correlates him being one of the Elohim. And not even the upper Elohim, one of the lower Elohims. Wow. Okay, we're going to head and stop here. We're going to start again on page 157, chapter 9, People and Property. I bet Yahweh's name is going to be all over this one. Yeah. Okay, till next time, guys.